Hi, I'm Tim Leet, and I am the Executive Director of Heart of Character. Welcome to Fostering a Sense of Community in Online Learning. As I record this, it's early July, summer 2020, and there's a lot of uncertainty in what returning to school is going to look like this fall. Most of you watching this finished last year in an online learning, remote learning environment, and if you're like me, it was had its ups and downs. But one of the things that's true is we entered that experiment with relationships with the kids, with a sense of community that we had already built over the first half of the year, the first 2/3 or even 3/4 of the year. The prospect of going back and beginning school in any kind of remote capacity is a different sort of proposition, isn't it? And it requires us to think hard about what can we do in this new environment to establish that sense of community, to build those relationships that we know are so important in education. Education, obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here. Education is obviously not simply transmitting information back and forth. It's not this transactional experience. It's an emotional, invested experience. And we use this idea of community as a placeholder for all kinds of things, emotional investment, care, and how do we do that? How do we do that through this interface that you're watching me through? We'll start this presentation with just a few early thoughts, followed by a little deeper dive into what I'm going to mean when I talk about belonging, the most sort of salient basic psychological need when we're talking about building community. What is belonging? And how can I contrast fitting in from a sense of belonging? It's really an important thing to understand. And that'll constitute maybe the first third of the video. And the bulk, though, will be devoted to practical strategies and advice that you can use in your classroom, and then later a few suggestions at a slightly higher level, maybe things that will appeal to administrators or school leaders or program leaders in some capacity that take a look at the division or the school at a higher level. Okay, so let's get started. In contemplating this video, one of the things that came up pretty early in discussions with my colleagues is we have to acknowledge that schools are unique, right? And that what I might suggest here as a strategies for community building need to be filtered and refracted through the lens of your own school. And the first place to look at that is probably at the mission statement. You know, what are those things that are special to your school that you want to prioritize, that every teacher and every program is going to want to prioritize, and how can I recreate that experience or that priority? How can I achieve that priority in this environment? But you're also going to want to look at your priorities, right? You are every bit a member of the community as much as anybody else. And so what is it that you value? What are those most important things to you that keep you in this profession and keep you coming back for these kids? And you're going to want to build, no matter where you are, you're going to want to build intentional strategies around school priorities and your priorities. I've underlined the word intentional there to draw attention. Well, let me say it a different way. I remember my first year of teaching was over 20 years ago, and I remember how much thought and planning went into the relationship building part of school. and as I anticipated time with kids, how do I connect with them? How do I build these relationships? How do I help them build relationships with each other? And then how do we plug into the larger narrative of school life? And how do I facilitate this community building? That was my curriculum and my academic part, but this part about community building was a very conscious and deliberate thing. And despite the fact that I've been teaching over 20 years, I think of this fall and my feelings are that I'm a new teacher again. And I want to suggest that it might be helpful for all of us to think, I'm a first-year teacher again. And I need to intentionally do things that may have become just part of my program, part of my habits, part of my shtick. The things that have worked for me over the years, from greeting rituals at the door to finding those kids in my class who are always at risk for disengaging, who just aren't charmed by my style, and figuring out how am I going to connect with this kid? How am I going to keep this kid in the community, right? So those things that I didn't think so much about, after the first couple years, now I need to think about again. Intentional community building strategies. But people are people, right? And so while your uniqueness is really important, our sameness is really important as well. And I want to return to the basic psychological needs of autonomy, belonging, and competence. And to say again that it's this need to belong that really surfaces among these three as the one we really want to focus on, and the one that I'm going to really elaborate on coming up here after this. Now, that doesn't mean that our need for autonomy and competence are irrelevant. When my need as a student for autonomy is acknowledged and respected, I'm feeling a sense of trust and respect. A full participant, it engages me, it brings me in. I'm not merely complying, but I'm engaged and involved. And that's part of community building too. And with competence as well, that my instructor sees me, right, and recognizes me, understands where I'm strong and where I'm going to need a little help. That experience builds trust and a sense that I'm seen here and I belong here. So we'll talk a lot about belonging here coming up, but I don't want to write off autonomy and competence as irrelevant to building a sense of community. To that end, you will find a sheet that we produced, Heart of Character produced back in the spring as schools were moving to remote learning, that talks a lot about suggestions related to autonomy and competence and belonging for launching an online experience successfully. You're going to see this purple circle a lot here in the next several slides, and I'm going to use it. I say my classroom, I should have put quotes around it because it's a placeholder for any space where an adult, you, or leader of some type is responsible for setting the tone, right? And so classroom is the easiest place to imagine that happening. So let's just picture our students arriving outside of our classroom door. And students are different. And so sticking with my simple geometry theme, let's just say these kids are starting to congregate outside my door and it's time for me to invite them in. In the fall, that might look like bringing kids into my Zoom session in person. Of course, it looks a different way that you're familiar with. But in the end, you still have different kids with different needs and different abilities and different backgrounds, all arriving for an experience that you are curating. Now, what I thought early on in my education is that my job is to throw the doors wide open and just bring all of these lovely people into my room. They're not of different types. They're all students, right? Well, that proved to be kind of a naive way of approaching it for me. And so I want to just say, so throwing those doors wide open, and this model might look like this, where every kid comes in, every kid gets to bring their full selves into the room, no matter the color and the shape, and they all have elbow room in what I'm going to characterize as the unexamined classroom culture. Because this isn't how it works. This isn't how it works at all. Because as the adult in charge, we maintain and set a very particular classroom culture. And that classroom culture most often is an extension of the culture we're most comfortable with. And cultures have all sorts of practices and rituals and artifacts that are a part of it. Emotional expressiveness is a big one. How close do you stand to kids? Do you ever touch them? How hard and fast are you about punctuality? Am I focusing on individuals? Are my desks separated and isolated and spread out in a grid, or are they focused more in clusters pointed toward each other? There are a lot of things we do, mostly unconscious, to set up a particular classroom culture. And I want to invite you here to hit the pause button on this video and take a little longer look at this list and think about your classroom culture or your Zoom session or your club space. And what are some of the norms that you've established, and how hard and fast do you hold them? And do you notice that some kids have no trouble plugging in while others struggle or don't even try? So hit pause and think about that for a little. I'm going to assume you've done that and that you're back now live with me. Because rather than throwing the door open wide, a better way to think about this is that this culture sets up very particular ports, plug-in spots for kids to join into the classroom. I've got to come up with better language. Plug-in spots is terrible, but you'll get the idea as soon as I show you these shapes, right? Here are my kids, those same kids that were outside the purple circle in my classroom. They're waiting to join in, and you can probably already see where this is going. I'm going to just take two shapes, and I'm going to use those to illustrate the difference between three ways to think about that kid's experience in your space, right? Some kids are going to misfit. Some kids are going to do their best to fit in. And then there's a third one, the one we're aiming for, which is the experience of belonging. In misfitting, first of all, before we go further, take a look at how nicely tucked in those blue squares are. Now, these are the kids who come from places very much like the place I came from, right? As I extend my cultural assumptions into the classroom and create norms around those assumptions, those kids walk into my room with exactly the same assumptions. And I'm unconscious of what I'm doing. They're unconscious of why it's such a good fit. But these kids are very aware of what a misfit that those cultural norms are for them. So either they can't, or by rightful pride say, I'm not going to distort who I am to be part of this. And they will persistently sit on the outside of the experience. So I want to characterize that as misfitting. Fitting in is a different kind of experience for kids. The desire to belong is so strong that those red circles will do whatever kinds of gymnastics they need to try their best to fit into the culture space you've created in your classroom. The blue squares may be wondering why the red circles are finding it so hard, but the red circles are having to check parts of themselves. Some gets in, some has to get left out. but at no point are they nestled in that culture space like a baby bird in a nest the way the blue squares are. So that experience might, to an outsider, look like a belonging experience, but make no mistake, that's not a belonging experience. That is a fitting in experience. And fitting in is one of the great obstacles to a sense of belonging, because it gives this close enough impression. Again, maybe hit pause and think for a second, who are these kids for me? You know, think about last year, think about the last couple of years. Who are these kids who you know are working hard to make it work for them, but are having to leave bits of themselves outside? And do they have anything in common? All right, I will assume you've hit pause and are ready to move on. And let's move on to the idea of belonging. Now, the thing about the first two, misfitting and fitting in, is that nothing is asked of me as a teacher. I create my space for kids. And those kids who can tuck in there easily are happy to do so. But I'm not changing in my practice. Those kids aren't changing the way they understand. This just feels normal, right? This feels normal to these kids. The water the fish doesn't see, right? To create a sense of belonging, we need to widen the port. We need to take it from these crisp edges, and we need to fan out those edges so that we can invite a wider variety of people into the space. And I'm really leaning hard on this purple circle analogy, aren't I? But I want you to watch this transition. As those go from those rectangular to a wider opening, what we can see is that kids of all backgrounds, colors, shapes, sizes, cultures are able to tuck in here now. They're able to find a spot. None of them are quite as comfortable as those blue squares once were, right? Those blue squares are now rattling around in a bigger space, wondering why all of a sudden everyone has to be so careful about what they say. It used to be so easy, right? You might hear people using politically correct, pejoratively. But again, you want to think about what's lost. What's lost when I settle for fitting in or allow kids to just sit on the outside? You've got these cultural obstacles are preventing kids from being their full selves. This is a distorting and stressful and exhausting experience for these kids. The code switching undermines and compromise undermines the group cohesion. And I think maybe for us, for the teachers and the blue squares in the room, we can remain blind to our assumptions. The privilege of setting a culture and accepting the fact that some just can't get in there, can't find a home in there. It keeps us narrow and ignorant. And so what I want to offer here in this discussion of belonging is a more difficult, admittedly, but a more just approach to building community. Now, okay, I like this slide and I like this guy's face, How am I supposed, so what are you saying here, Tim? What are you saying? I have to cater to every individual student's cultural expectations? I'm a math teacher. I teach language arts. I'm not a culture expert. And I want to, again, go back to this analogy or to this visual and say that this is not what I'm advocating here. We're not crafting bird nests for baby birds of all different shapes, colors, and sizes. We're not trying to make it that comfortable for everybody. The object isn't comfort. The object is safety. So we're not needing to be all things to all people. We're looking at something more like this. After all, You may be familiar with this line from Brené Brown. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. Now, we're in the business of teaching, and so my only beef with that quote, at least as it applies to educators, is if that's it, then these kids are not going to be challenged and they're not going to change. But we know if this is what we need to do early. So here we are, right, at the front end of the fall. I'm trying to figure out, how do I start this year to build community? We want to remove as many conditions as we possibly can to belonging, to invite kids in as they are. But what we hope, right, over the course of a year is that they will be changed by that experience. Not necessarily to be more like me, the teacher, right? But challenged and disrupted from certain assumptions. And so while they may leave in a lot of ways much like they were when they left, they're not exactly the same. Okay. That is a rundown and an explanation of belonging. And I elaborated on, I spent a lot of time on it because I think it's really important, especially as we return to school this particular fall, right? The COVID crisis is very real and it's on everybody's mind, but that's not the only issue. That's not the only crisis in this country right now. And so we want to be especially mindful of community, not just as a place for those who are willing can fit in, but we need to try even harder to make it a place where everyone can fit in. Okay, let's get practical. All right, we want to get down to the particulars. What can I do? What can I do in anticipation of the fall? What can I do when I get started? What can I keep doing as the months roll by? And I want to deliver 10 strategies that you can use in a classroom setting. So this will be aimed primarily at teachers. We'll follow that quickly with 6 strategies that may apply at a higher level, whether larger groups of people, whether it be a division or even the whole school. But let's go ahead and get started with our 10 strategies for your classroom. First, as I said in the opening, this community building that we're going to be having to do this fall needs to be intentional. And part of that intention is to place it structurally into the lessons, right? We can't rely on things happening organically. As much as all of us prefer that method, we're going to have to structure some of this into it. We need to begin these lessons with something that invites every single member into the space. A colleague of mine in New York uses this thing. It's a really rapid fire thing called a weather report. What's the weather like what's the weather like where you are? And on, weather obviously being a metaphor for your emotional state or the activities in your life or what's going on around you. A simple 1 to 10. Another friend uses a brand of cards called Vertelis cards that are full of conversation prompts. She sent me a few when I told her I was going to do this. One of her favorites is, if you had 15 seconds and the whole world were listening, what would you say? Can you imagine starting class with that? And it's just a quick, you may not have time to drill down into each of their responses, but it's a quick way to bring everybody in, and the answers are interesting. Which moment would you most like to relive? What's your biggest mistake? That might be a tough one, right? I like this one. Who would you like to thank? So not only with something like that are you bringing people into a common space with a common thought, you're also invoking an emotion of gratitude, which puts people in a much more receptive place for learning. Second, know and use every student's name. This is so important. Research shows clearly that the use of a person's name lights up all all the positive centers in the brain that produce feelings of well-being. It's a recognition, and the symbolism of a person's name is deeply, deeply powerful. I am famously bad with names, as it turns out, but I really do think they're a huge priority. I've been known, well, each year I have to learn maybe 130, 140 names, and I've been known to make flashcards. I copy the student directory and tape the names that I printed and cut out onto the backs of all those flashcards, and just maybe in early August, mid-August, as I'm getting ready to come back, I'm really drilling myself on the names. That may be overkill. Maybe that's only necessary for someone as bad as names as I am, with names as I am. But consider the names you struggle most with. If you look like me, you're probably not struggling with Emma, Matt, and Jared. There are other names that are giving you a lot more problems. And when you think about it, that for a lot of these kids, they are experience school often in the margins. Maybe they're not in the heart of every default assumption in the culture. And so that symbolic power of the name is that much more significant for those students. So I strongly recommend to lean into those names that are going to give you trouble, because the symbolic power of using it and pronouncing it correctly is very powerful. I think I will now show in the video, I'll show you some of the text beneath the heading, give you a second to read it, and then move forward. Three, you want to get to know your kids in the class as more than students. Importantly is that they can tell. I think all of us would say, of course I want to get to know my students, my students as people also. But not in every case can the kids tell, right? And so it's really, for this to be a powerful community building strategy, the kids have to be able to tell that you're sincerely interested in getting to know them. It can be something simple, maybe you keep a birthday calendar and you have in your class online Zoom session or whatever you're using, you have some way of celebrating birthdays, for example, right? I want to add also that if a student goes out of her way to share something with you that's not classroom related, that might be related to family or friends or the arts or athletics or something personal, make a note of that. That's an invitation. It's a subtle one, but it's an invitation to be involved in that student's life as more than just an instructor, right? Make a note of that and follow up, right? Come back to them. How did that go? How did that conversation you were so afraid of go? How did that, how are things going right now at home? Or did you get the car fixed? Whatever it is. And really invest in those one-on-one moments. I'm reminded when I click this that one of the great suggestions that I think I'm going to use this year is this introductory video. Sort of further down the advice line is going to be something about technology. And a great idea, and two birds with one stone sort of thing, is to have your students in your class create introductory videos. Maybe you've got 2 or 3 or 4 questions that you want them to respond to. They say their name, they pronounce how they would like to be addressed, or pronouns if that's appropriate in your school, and they can share some personal things with them. Maybe it's even shot at home where there will be the background of their room or whatever. And have them upload it and add a little text, and this way you're actually checking off the can we get over the technology obstacles, and I'm learning a bit about them, and I'm getting their name and how to pronounce it. It's a great idea. Number 4, you want to develop and maintain clear expectations. This is going to be a nerve-wracking fall. I think it's just best to acknowledge that up front. And people are going to be apprehensive about the whole experience. And one of the things that we can do to build trust is to make the experience with students predictable. Now, often predictable gets a bad rap, but when anxiety levels are up, or there's a culture mismatch going on and some kids are feeling, that they're at best fitting in and perhaps misfitting, to try to be predictable and lay out expectations plainly is a real service we can do for them. Developing a classroom contract, collaborating with students in that regard is a great idea. This is not an invitation to say, so kids, how do you want to run school? Because that's freedom without boundaries. Remember, autonomy says we want to give kids choice and decision-making power within constraints. So you kind of set some non-negotiables, and then you talk about how, like within those parameters, how should we do this? And revisit those expectations as we go along. This grand experiment that we're kicking off in the fall of 2020. No one expects that, going in, we're going to have the best solution. So you want to revisit those expectations as the year moves on. You may have noticed something about these first 4, right? These are exactly the things we do when we're at our best in person, aren't they? There isn't something special, techie online so much about these strategies. These are important human priorities and human strategies for building community. You want to intentionally have community building time. The name thing is so important, and you want to know them as more than just students in your classroom. And you want to have those clear expectations. Just thought I'd point that out. Let's move on to number 5. Number 5 is to tell stories. I promise that in a sagging moment in a lesson, in person or online, if you begin a sentence with, I remember a time when I was in high school, all the heads will come up and all the wandering attention will come right back to you, okay? Or middle school, or 4th grade, or whatever age it is that you work with. If there is an introduction to storytelling time, and if you begin to narrate in that way, you will bring them in. Learning is an emotional experience, and storytelling is a fantastic way to engage the emotions. I teach physics as well as some moral philosophy and psychology, and physics, it won't surprise you to learn, can get dry. And storytelling has become one of the best strategies I have for keeping it alive, for keeping kids interested, for keeping them smiling and laughing, and it's what they remember, and they come back and say, "Oh, I remember the time you laughed." Yes. Number 6. Recognize and accept the fact that kids are going to need different things from you. Okay, and this is going to echo a lot. This echoes a lot of the themes in the widening the port, right? That there are going to be kids who tuck in there comfortably because a lot of your default and worldview, ways of being, assumptions match theirs, and there's going to be a certain amount of comfort, but that's not going to work for everybody, is it? And that we want to lean in toward those kids we know are at risk for falling for falling out, for disengaging, for unplugging. We want to, if we anticipate at points in the year we're going to need to have difficult conversations one-on-one with the kid, we want to get in front of that and begin with a positive conversation. We want to extend what a colleague of mine called micro affirmations. You know, those moments where, you know, I see you, I see you. Certainly, I see you in a bigger sense than I'm looking at you, right? I don't have to explain that. Number 7. And got a little ahead of myself several points before when I talked about identifying and removing technical obstacles to full engagement. I remember a time a few years ago when a student of mine was struggling, and we were about a month into the class, and I pulled her aside and I said, something's going on here. Can I, is something not working? Is there something, personalities in the room? Is it something, maybe I'm doing something that inadvertently? And she told me that she hadn't been able to download the textbook yet. Here I am thinking it's some kind of deep cultural mystery. And when really she just was struggling with connectivity and figuring out how to download the iBook for the class. Sometimes it doesn't, for kids who may be inclined to unplug and disengage from the community, sometimes it doesn't take much but a little technical speed bump to give them psychological reason to pull back. And you want to try to iron those out quickly and as quickly as possible to identify those and make a commitment to them. We're going to get all these technical issues resolved inside of the first 2 weeks. Number 8, have fun together. If you've taught more than one day in your life, you know how powerful laughter is in bringing a community together. There are so many ways you can do this. We did it with show and tell in the spring. We did it with theme days. You can have funny hats or turtlenecks, or you can bring in fun activities. There are quiz games you can play online. A friend of mine, Heart of Character colleague in North Carolina, said, do a quick scavenger hunt. Send the kids out looking for just random home things. Come back with a tube of toothpaste, a cookie, and a striped pillowcase. You have 3 minutes. Go and see what comes back. It will also accomplish the first item, which is to begin class with something that brings everybody in emotionally and in their attention. So highly recommend fun activities. Number 9. As intimidating and maybe as unappealing as the prospect of a year or part of a year online may be, it does open up some new opportunities. Last spring, as our physics class was winding down and we were moving on to electricity and electrical circuits, I was just pulling my hair out thinking, how are we going to do this? I've been teaching this subject for 20 years. I know exactly what I want to do and how to do it. But I couldn't, because we couldn't be there together. And my co-teacher said, well, why don't we, she always had the better ideas. She said, well, why don't we break up the topic and give them to kids and have them do research? Maybe they review, several websites on whatever the topic is, solar panels, nuclear power plant, batteries, things like that, and have them review several websites and write up sort of professional reviews of the website, saying where it's strong and where it's weak, and then and they can submit their reviews. And then she went one step further and said, what else they can do? They can make up little quizzes, and the other kids who aren't researching that topic can take the quizzes after reviewing the website. Anyway, it was fantastic. It was a great idea, and it's never the sort of thing you would have done in person, but it gave kids so much more autonomy. They were able to choose the topics, they chose the sites that they evaluated, and they made the recommendations themselves and created the quizzes. It turned out to be a terrific way, and if I were to ever teach electrical circuits again, I would probably do it because it proved to be an outstanding way of teaching that I never would have considered. Getting to the end here. Number 10. If what you're doing isn't working, stop. And this may seem patently obvious, but from personal experience, there's a desire to just kind of lower my head and just keep pressing, even when I can see the kids have I've left them, I've left them behind me or something. So we're in a Zoom call, and it's hard to feel energy in a Zoom call in the first place, but when there's none, you can tell, okay? And when something isn't working, just stop, pull back, regroup. This grand experiment that none of us are excited about embarking on this fall, none of us knows exactly the right way to proceed. There's no playbook. And so in a lot of ways, we need to be humble enough to stop, to check in with the kids and say, how can I make this better? What's not working? Where did I lose you? Let's rewind. I'm not wedded to this approach. Do you have some suggestions? What's working well in another class that's covering similar type of material? Do you have some other experience in some other classes that you can share with me? Maybe I can get better at doing this. There are a lot of things that we can do, and this is not just community building by inviting them into the course design process. It's a great sign of respect. It's a granting of a certain kind of autonomy and a competence recognition that maybe you have something I could learn from. Okay. I hope you found some good material in there. And it's time to move on to 6 strategies for the school or division as you had, again, as I've said, a slightly higher altitude. First of all, when you're leading, lead from an authentic place. I've harped on this enough that I'm certainly giving you an interior view of my own mind as we approach this, but there's going to be some anxiety associated with this, right? And of course, in leading, we need to lead with a confidence, but also with a kind of humility and an acknowledgement that I can learn from you and we are in this together. And I have a lot of faith in us as a team to get through this. We can do this. I know we can do this. And this is going to be a better community building strategy for the entire group of people, whether it's a department or a group of faculty or even bigger than that, as a way of bringing people in and getting them bonded to each other over a shared mission. Number 2, as number 1 in the last one, we need to set time aside for community building. Much like we set time aside in the classroom for intentional community building. Our division head in the school I work in begins each faculty meeting, even the Zoom meetings that we had toward the end of last year, with what she calls gratitude months. In the same way that we want to invite people emotionally into the classroom space, setting time aside for community building in meetings or in the daily course of events that happen at school is going to remain important and probably be even more important in this year that we're approaching. Number 3, explore creative and safe ways of seeing each other in person. You may have done this, we certainly did, and if space allows or the logistics of your school allow, we did driveway visits. We The class of 2020 seniors did a big parade up the driveway and around the bus loop and back out of the school to much great fanfare, balloons and faculty and masks 6 feet apart, all waving and cheering them. If we are in some kind of protracted lockdown and we're learning remotely, schedule these in. That we can do a lot online, but in my experience, there is nothing like locking eyes with somebody, real eyes with somebody, in person. It's just impossible to recreate online. So if you, to the extent you can engage any face-to-face activities, that's a huge recommendation. And if you are in a situation where you have faculty or students who for reasons are unable to attend in person at all, and there are many reasons that might be true, figure out a way and a person who's going to do a driveway visit, who's going to drive by. Maybe it's a conversation through a closed window, but please don't let those faculty, staff, or students go months while others are convening and seeing each other in person, isolated at home without a friendly face showing up in the driveway. Number 4. This is a personal favorite of mine, not one that comes up when I discuss this topic with my my Heart of Character colleagues, so this may be a little idiosyncratic to me, but I have had a lot of success with video making. You may or may not think that's possible given your reaction to this one, but but if you can find those high social capital adults in the community who are willing to send a positive message out to the school, that can be something that people talk about. That's something that people chat about or exchange texts about, something that connects people together, and we want it to be upbeat. There's even a place, isn't there, for older kids to send encouraging messages, video messages to younger kids in the school. If you have a school that spans a great range of ages, just imagine the seniors doing short little positive messages to younger kids in other classes. We can do this, we can do hard things, those good kinds of messages that can pull people together. I'm going to show you a Heart of Character colleague and a friend and co-worker of mine here, and I just want to show you his an example of how he does.
Good morning, Vikes. Dr. Losambe here. We miss you. I hope you're doing well. I hope you took the weekend to kind of relax from such a full and busy week, a week that was filled with getting used to the online platform and trying to maintain connections that you have with each other in a different format. Talking to the faculty last week, the common theme was they miss those face-to-face interactions and they really miss you very much. Thank you so much.
So you get an idea of what you can project in a video that doesn't come through in an email, that doesn't come through in most other formats that are available when we're working online. Thank you, Pascal. Number 5. Just 2 more. As with students, when you're dealing with staff and faculty, we need to remove technology obstacles. Lots of adults are going to be very apprehensive about doing their job and doing it well online. To the extent we can remove technical obstacles, we ought to. Finally, number 6. Consider creating a centralized, make it easy to use, okay? A centralized system for keeping tabs on students. One of our Heart of Character team members in New Orleans last spring, she, as dean, was concerned. She was just losing track. She had no way of tending the flock I think was her expression. She didn't know where they were. The sheep had wandered off, and she couldn't pull them back. And an elegant and simple solution was a Google Doc that she created that all faculty were invited to contribute to, where when a teacher perceived that a student was sliding a little bit, maybe missing class or not engaging at all, or missing assignments, or just getting the sense that this kid might be struggling, there's a message kind of posted in that Google Doc that my friend tracked all day, every day. And teachers, when the same name starts showing up from different teachers, is making a quick call home. How are things going? How can we help? This is hard on everybody. What can I do here to make this, to take obstacles away, or how can I help? And what she reported from that experience was that early on, an enormous number of names were showing up on that Google Doc, and she was working very hard to stay in communication with these families and to put out these fires. But so quickly that curve dropped to where by the end it was a trickle. As you know, kids, if you can solve problems early, you can keep them in. And that is what the value of one of these centralized sort of record-keeping systems can be. This brings us to the end of fostering a sense of community in online learning. I hope you got a few useful nuggets out of it. As I said from the beginning, the intentionality around community building is going to have to be higher than it's ever been. And I think for me, it's helpful to just say, like it or not, Tim, you're a first-year teacher again. And to invest in those strategies, whether they're any of the 10 or 6 that we listed here, or ones of your own. Remember that your school will have mission priorities, you will have priorities, but there are human priorities of autonomy, belonging, and competence. And when it comes to community building, it's belonging that's going to be most important to all. So I wish you well, and thank you for being there for our kids.